Okay, we are on chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, and salvation is almost at hand. We're past the halfway point, so we're so far on schedule. So chapter 14 is a chapter I think is kind of interesting because normally when you're reading your Bible, you would read through this chapter and you say, okay, here's a wise woman that comes before David. She gives him a story, and then Absalom comes back to Jerusalem. And we really don't look at the impact, or at least the import of what this particular chapter details. And I think it's good for us to look at it because there's some things that we I think need to point out that is kind of imperative to understanding David's rule and his judgments and things of that nature. So anyway, so to get started, let's take a look at who we have and where we're at. We see that our main characters in this particular chapter is David and Joab, and then there's a reference to a wise woman from Tekoa. And it's kind of interesting that they refer to her as a wise woman. I got to thinking about that. I said, I think Joab needed a woman that could portray a widow that was destitute, was in need of help, but at the same time could think quick on her feet to answer questions that David may put towards her. So he just didn't need someone that would just ramble and not really put forth a good argument. So he had to find a wise woman, and he found one in Tekoa. Then we have Absalom, and mention of his three sons and his daughter Tamar, which evidently he named after his sister. Only two locations. We have Jerusalem, where the events take place, and Tekoa, from where this woman was at. And looking at it on the map, Tekoa is about 10 miles to the south of Jerusalem, and so the distance wasn't all that far that they had to travel. And I always like to make references, that's kind of like between here and Beaumont, so they didn't have to go very far. Now, the chapter synopsis is kind of like, I tried to shorten this up, and then after I shortened it up, I said, no, I might make it a little bit longer, and then I kind of bounced back and forth, and this is what we came up with. First three verses, we see that Joab devises a plan for a wise woman to persuade David to bring Absalom home. Verses 4 through 7, the woman tells a story of a brother killing the other, and the whole family sought the killer's life. And then 8 through 11, David pardons the man for killing his brother. 12 through 17, the woman insinuates the stories about Absalom and his exile. And I didn't know if that was a correct definition of that, but she does seem to insinuate that, at least in my viewpoint. Then 18 through 20, the woman reveals that Joab is behind this request. 21 to 27, David sends Joab to bring Absalom home to Jerusalem. 28 to 32, Absalom is ignored by David and Joab, and then finally in verse 33, Absalom is forgiven. So one thing we need to kind of understand as we go through this woman's story is the law of Moses in its reference to the law of inheritance. When we look in Numbers chapter 27, verses 8 through 11, the law says, "And you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give the inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give the inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give the inheritance to the relative closest to him and his family, and he shall possess it." Now, as you go through the story of this woman, and as she relates it, we'll see that in just a moment. It's pretty much, she's presenting herself as destitute before David. And the reason why is because of this law of inheritance. If her son is dead, then she pretty much loses everything because the inheritance goes to family members. And at the same time, she tells David, it's the family members that wants to put my son to death. And it's kind of like, let's get rid of the only remaining son, then we can inherit all this property. So it's kind of she's showing it's a two-edged sword for her. She's not only going to lose her only other son, but now the family seems to be after her inheritance. So anyway, that's kind of some of the things I saw there. So what is this encounter really all about? The encounter, I think, is to bring Absalom out of exile and protect him from harm when he comes back to Jerusalem. And this was to forgive Absalom of his crime, even as as God had forgiven David of his crime with Bathsheba and the death of Uriah. Specifically, the death of Uriah, I would think. And also to get David to see the problems of the heir and parent to the throne being exiled from the nation. It's always been I guess the rule of thumb is that the firstborn inherits, the kingdom, if it's in the case of the king. If the firstborn dies, it kind of goes to the second, then the third, and then the fourth, and so on forth down the line. So David, he's trying to show David the problems that with the heir and parent to the throne would cause the nation by him being exiled. And also to show the nation that David is a righteous and forgiving king. And then ultimately, I think it's Joab's efforts to bring stability to David's reign and to keep the nation united under his rule. As we said, David's rule, I think, had hit a plateau, and now it's kind of in a decline. We've already seen, after his sin with Bathsheba, we see that Absalom killed his brother. Absalom's now in exile, and the nation itself is beginning to look at their leader as, what's going on here? What's wrong with David's judgments? What's happening in David's family? What's happening to the nation? If David falls, what's going to happen to us? And so I think this is probably the second example we have of Joab doing what, as I said before, damage control. We saw that when he was just about to conquer the city of Rabbah, he called for David to come to take the city, lest the people say that I was the one that conquered it. And now he's looking at the situation that, David was longing for a son, but he was keeping his son in exile. He's trying to show David the damage that it's causing to the nation. You really need to bring this man back home. So Joab is looking out for David to a certain degree, and at the same time, I think, looking out for himself. So this is kind of what this encounter is really all about. So let's take a look at it. We see at the beginning of this chapter, he says in verse 1, so Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. There was no doubt that David was concerned about the son being in exile for 3 years. 3 years. And so he sent, Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and told her, this is what you're going to do. Kind of pretty much planted the words in her mouth. He said, you will pretend to be a mourner, you'll put on the apparel, you will not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who's been mourning for a long time for the dead. And then go to the king and speak to him in this manner. So Joab pretty much sets the pace of what David is fixing to hear. It's kind of like the same thing with Nathan coming to David. He could have simply came to David and said, David, you're the man that's committed sin against God. But instead, he gives him a story that gets David to thinking about the judgment of this particular man. Now, Joab's pretty much doing the same thing. He's sending a woman to David to get David to think about the judgments of against the family and against her son. So she comes to David, falls on her face, and says, help, O king. And then he says, what troubles you? He said, and then she begins, he says, indeed, I'm a widow, my husband is dead. Now your manservant had 2 sons, and they fought with each other in the field, and there was no one to part them, and the one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole family has risen up against your maidservant, and said, deliver him who has struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of the other brother, whom he killed, and we will destroy the heir also. So they would extinguish my ember that is left, and leave my husband neither name nor remnant on the earth. Now she's pretty much telling him, what's happening in her family, and then she's kind of making the application back to Numbers chapter 35. It's, we will kill the remaining son, we will kill the heir. She will, her family, the name of the family will be extinguished, and she will have nothing left on this earth, because then with the death of the husband, the death of the sons, the inheritance goes to the rest of the family. So David's kind of looking at this, and he tells her, go to your house and I will give orders concerning you. So he's probably mulling all of this over, that this woman's pretty much going to be in poverty and relying upon whatever she can find on the streets as far as handouts. And then the woman of Tekoa said to the king, O my lord, let the iniquity be on me and on my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless. So now she's showing David that whatever judgment you place upon me, even though they may appear to be contrary to what the law of Moses says, that is, if you were to save my son and not require him to be put to death according to what Numbers 35 says, let this be upon my head. I will take the blame, I will take all responsibility, I'll even be punished for it, so that you, as you sit on your throne, will be guiltless, and that no one can raise a finger to you and say that you have ruled unjustly on this particular thing. And then the king tells us, says, if anyone says to you, bring him to me, so the king said, whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you anymore. So now he's beginning to show pity upon this woman because of what she has lost. And kind of make an analogy here, he should be showing pity upon the nation of Israel for what they have lost. But at the same time, he's saying, bring them to me, they shall not touch you anymore. You will be protected. If, as we see at the end of this story, when Joab brings Absalom back to Israel, the analogy, or at least the comparison that we need to make here, is that no one will touch Absalom's head for the sin that he committed in killing his son. So Joab is kind of putting the plot into place, and this wise woman is able to use her knowledge of the law and what needs to be done with the nation, and she's putting together a good story here. So she says, please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not prevent the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. So now she's saying, please remember the blessings of the Lord, and spare my son. Then he says, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. So now he's pretty much made the judgment call on this, that there will nothing happen to your son. You'll be safe. And with this particular judgment, he should be placing in his mind the acts of righteousness and the acts of kindness to those that may be guilty of punishment, but yet the consequences affects other people. Therefore the woman said, please let your maidservant speak another word to the Lord the king. And he said, say on. I'm kind of surprised that he's allowed this to go as long as he has. But what is really surprising is the next statement that she makes to the king. So the woman said, why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? So the analogy, or the story, the hypothetical story that she just gave David, she's now accusing David of doing the same thing. The heir apparent is in exile, and now why won't you bring him back and protect him, even as you promised to protect my son? Because what you have schemed is against the people of God. With the heir apparent out of Israel in exile, you're supporting this exile. The nation itself is saying, we have no heir, what's going to happen to our nation? We're going to fall back probably the way it was in the day of the judges. The nation will be divided, every man will do what's right on his own side, and there won't be any rule. There won't even be just rule that you're giving this particular nation. Why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this thing as one who is guilty, and that the king does not bring the banished one home again. For we will surely die and become like water spilled upon the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away a life, but he devised means so that the banished ones are not expelled from him. We all live and die, but as long as we have life, and as time is now with us today, you need to rectify this, because once we're dead, it cannot be corrected. You need to bring the banished one home, and not allow him to be expelled. You need to correct this as soon as you can. Now therefore I have come to speak this thing to my Lord, the king. The people have made me afraid, and your maidservant said, I will speak to the king of it. And I'm not really sure. I kind of think she's saying that the people that's made her afraid is maybe reverting back to the original story, is that, you know, my kinsmen have made me fearful, therefore I've come before the king, and I brought this to your attention. You know, but we'll see again too that she continues this hypothetical type of question. He says, for the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who will destroy me and my son together from the inheritance of God. There we go back to the hypothetical story. Trying to keep this foremost in David's mind after she's made this accusation against him. You've done the nation an injustice, even as this particular story is, my family wants to do me an injustice. So in the story, the family is pretty much, I guess, representation of the king David himself, and that she herself is Israel. And now she's making that analogy that the nation of Israel is suffering because of your judgments against the person that's, I guess, in line to inherit the throne. He says, the maidservant said, the word of my God, Lord, the king, will now be comforting. As the angels of God, so is my Lord, the king, in discerning good and evil. And may the Lord God be with you. In other words, she's showing David that your judgments are right. You're able to make the right and wrong decisions, and I know that the Lord will be with you. And then the king, I guess at this point, he's beginning to catch on to what was happening, what the analogy of the story was, her accusations against him, and that now I have to make a judgment call about my own family. And the king answered and said to the woman, please don't hide from me anything that I ask you. And the woman said, please, my lord, let my lord the king speak. He says, the hand of Joab with you in all this. Evidently, Joab has been talking to David previously about this situation. So David is kind of thinking, you know, Joab is now taking a different approach, and I guess I really need to think about this. And of course, she acknowledges it. She said, your servant Joab commanded me, and he put all these words in my mouth for your maidservant, to bring about this change of affairs. Your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise according to the wisdom of the angels of God to know everything that is on the earth. In other words, she's saying you're able to see through this ruse that we're putting before you, and able to understand that what has been discussed to you before, you really need to bring a judgment to it, and that it needs to come to some type of fruition. So she compliments David on his ability to discern things, and yes, Joab was the one that put these words into your mouth, but it was for the good of the nation in which we're doing it. And then the king said to Joab, all right, I have granted this thing. Go therefore and bring the young man to Absalom. And Joab fell on the ground to his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord, O king, and that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant. So he arose, he went to Geshur, and he brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And here was the stipulation about his return. He says, let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face. So Absalom returned to his house, and he didn't see the king's face. And this went on for another couple of years. So with that said, Absalom and David hadn't seen each other now for 5 years. And I think Absalom was thinking that now that I'm returning to Jerusalem and I've got the king's protection in his favor, I can return home, and now I can probably have a better chance to ascend to the throne now that David is, to some extent, has forgiven me. Now the text kind of deviates from that to a little bit about Absalom himself. And it says that Absalom says that now in all Israel there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. So You know, here we go. He says, from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, that is, at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. When he weighed it, the hair of his head was 200 shekels according to the king's standard. I was going to look up what the weight was for 200 shekels, and I forgot to do that. But let's just put it this way, it was a lot of weight. 200 shekels is a lot of weight. So we start to see the vanity that Absalom had. He knew that he was a perfect example of manhood. The nation, when they looked upon Absalom, they saw that he was someone, I guess, that could win the Mr. Universe contest. And he took so much pride in his appearance that he let his hair grow long because, he just loved his hair. Kind of back like when we were back in the 70s.
5 pounds.
5 pounds. Okay. So he had a good thick head of hair. I will say this without giving it away. I never really thought about this, but when a few chapters down the road, when Absalom was fleeing David, he ran and his head got caught in a tree. I always wondered, how in the world did his head get caught in a tree? Now I understand. With 5 pounds of hair, if you hit a tree, you're going to get tangled up and you're not going to pull yourself loose. And the more you pull yourself loose, the more it's going to get you tangled up. So his hair was his own downfall, I think. But anyway, he was, I think, vain in his appearance. He knew people loved him, and he just used it for every bit of, every bit of glory that he could get for himself. And like I said, he let it grow, cut it once a year. That shows vanity. And then he said, to Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar, and she was a woman of beautiful appearance. So what the text is telling us here is that it appears that Absalom has got the perfect family. He's the, if there's anyone to be a king of Israel, this is the man that needs to ascend the throne after David. They're looking at the appearance of Absalom just like they were looking at the appearance of Saul. And Saul was a big man. He was, well liked, and just there was nothing wrong with him from the appearance from the outside. But God had told Samuel when he went to anoint David that I don't look on the outward appearance, I look on the heart of the man, and that's why David was anointed. So we see this particular paragraph put in here to show us his vanity. Now, he says that Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. Therefore, Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. Now, Absalom, as he came back to Geshur, now found himself in Jerusalem. He's 1 step closer to where he needed to be, but now nobody of any importance wants to pay him any attention. For 2 years, David has refused to see him. Joab has ignored any request for an audience with him to try to persuade him to go see David. And now he's had 3 years in Geshur, 2 years here in Jerusalem. And these 2 years, I think, were the vital 2 years, because I think they began to form the next actions of Absalom in relation to what he's about to do. He began to see that if David's going to continue to ignore me, how can I ascend to the throne even though the nation knows the way I am? David may do something to put me off to the side and maybe anoint one of his other sons, and I'm not going to let that happen. So now he begins to scheme, I think, to a particular part, and we'll see that in the next chapter, that I'm going to do what I think is necessary for my own benefit to get what I want out of this country. David's ignored me. I'm not going to go for it any further. So he sends for Joab. Joab ignores him, and the second time he called, Joab ignored him. So now we're going to do something to get Joab's attention. It says Joab's field was near mine, so he has some barley out there, which I guess was very fast burning. And so he told his servants, go out there and set the field on fire. So we'll start burning his crops, and that ought to get Joab's attention, because if he loses his crops, he loses a significant part of his income. And he will want to come see me to find out why I did this. And his plan worked perfectly. He said, Joab arose, came to Absalom's house, and said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? And Absalom answered Joab and said, look, I sent to you saying, come here that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be still be there. He says, now therefore let me see the king's face. If there is any iniquity in me, let him execute me. He said, I can't live like this. If the king is found that still holds this grudge against me for killing Amnon, if there's any iniquity found in me for this particular act, he says, let the king strike me down and be done with it. He said, I'd just soon be dead than living in Jerusalem and not having any say-so in kingly matters. He said, he was probably thinking I was better off up in Geshur where my grandfather was at. He said, at least he was talking to me, and at least I was having some kind of some kind of say-so in the government up there. You know, it's not as big as Israel, but at least I had some importance in life. So it was better for me not to have left if I got to come down here and go through this kind of treatment. So Joab went to the king. I guess he didn't want the rest of his field burnt. So he went to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed him. So we see in this last particular verse that the king, I guess, finally forgave Absalom and was accepting him back into the family and was now considering him part of whatever happens in Jerusalem. But Absalom was not content with this. I think these 2 years that he spent being neglected by David, he's thinking this is now an opportunity for me to advance my plans one step further. I came back to Jerusalem. That's step one. Step two was get back into the king's favor. And then once in the king's favor, then I will begin to get into the favor of the nation or the people. And then from there, I will take over this kingdom. So he's beginning to make his plot and his plan as we see as we go into chapter 15. So Absalom was not only an heir to the throne, but his ambition, his greed was to the point that he's going to take it sooner than when it was actually due to him. And at the same time, and we'll see this in chapter 15, he's going to do David a great deal of harm in his actions. It's kind of like, David, you did me a great deal of harm by keeping me exiled for 3 years. He says, now it's time for payback. That's the way I see this particular thing beginning to unfold as we see in chapter 15. So Absalom was not always, the guilty party. I think he was the one that has learned to scheme, and now I think even though the king accepted him, I think Absalom liked that acceptance, and he was going to continue further on. Now, what are some lessons we can learn from all this? Well, first of all, like Joab, we should be concerned about the family unity. He was concerned about the united display, I guess you could call it, of David and his sons before the nation of Israel. We should be concerned about the family unity, not only at home, but within the church itself. The house divided cannot stand. And we, as ourselves, are the temple of God, and we cannot build a strong temple if we have stones that are faulty and that will crumble and fall, or may cause the alignment to not be straight. So we should be concerned about the family unity. Second thing is that we should be diligent in righteous judgment and not double standards. And that's what the wise woman was accusing David of towards the end of this discourse with her. She's saying, you are going to forgive my son who should be guilty of death by the law, and that you're going to offer him protection, but yet you will not show the same kind of judgment to your son Absalom. He's committed a great sin and travesty. You should show the same kind of love, concern, and protection to him as you have just now granted me with my hypothetical family. So we should be diligent in righteous judgment and not have double standards. Thirdly, we should be willing to totally forgive someone and not just have halfway forgiveness. And this is what David was demonstrating here. He was forgiving Absalom to the point of letting him return to Jerusalem, but he was not forgiving him enough to talk to the son and see him and try to work out the situation. He says, bring him back. That's as far as I'm going with it. So we should ourselves be willing to forgive someone totally and not halfway. And sometimes we find ourselves guilty of that. And we should not do that. If we're going to forgive someone, it has to be total forgiveness. Otherwise, it's not forgiveness at all. It's either total and not halfway. And then finally, we should guard ourselves against vanity, especially when other people praise us like Absalom. You ever have someone just praise you for some particular ability that you have or some other thing? And it's easy to let that go to your head. And we shouldn't let that. We should always try to show as much humility and being as humble as we can, even in the face of absolute praise. And we should be on our guard to that. And one other thing, I guess, we need to think about is how could someone like David, a father, show as much concern for Absalom even in his absence? You know, for what he did to the family. He killed his son. He ran away trying to escape punishment, but yet we see, like we saw in the last chapter, that David yearned to Absalom. And when we're young, we don't really think about how parents feel towards their children. We suffer when the children suffer. We may get angry at what our children do, but at the same time, we love them to the point that we want to try to correct them and forgive them and lead them down the same path that they need to go. I think all of us at some point in time have seen this within our families. Parents just spend their whole lives chasing after the so-called black sheep of the family, trying to care for them, trying to take care of them, try to correct them, and do what they can to make them part of the family once again. And at the same time in doing that, they may neglect the love for other children. So how does, when we look at David and we look at our own family situation, what happened in David's family was horrible, but yet he still showed a certain amount of love for Absalom and for his well-being. I guess he thought that as long as he's up in Geshur with his grandfather, he's in good hands and no one's going to harm him. Comes back to Jerusalem, I'll have to give him protection, but at the same time, he's here with me. That's as far as I'm going to go with it. And we should always be willing to forgive someone, even within our own family, all the way without holding any grudges or contentions. Anyway, I did all the speaking again. Any questions? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
The analogy with the wise woman, according to the law, and when her two sons fought, he would have been classed as a manslayer, not a murderer, correct?
Right.
So doesn't the analogy falls apart a little bit with Absalom premeditated murder with Amnon?
Not necessarily. One may be premeditated and the other one was done out of anger. And I guess when you look at premeditated murder, you're doing it, I guess, to a certain point out of anger or resentment or some other attitude of heart. And as the account says in Numbers chapter 35, if you fight, and if you're struck and you're killed, you're a manslayer. He said, but if you pushed and it was not intentional, then, or I'm not sure how the phrase says it, one's a manslayer and the other one's a murderer, killer. And the one that did it unintentionally, he's the one that goes to the cities of refuge and can have freedom of life. Whereas those that fight and one is struck dead and it was done out of malice or intention, then he's considered a killer. And I think even though phraseology is different, I think the law looks at the attitude of heart, if that makes any sense. So it kind of maybe pushing the boundaries a little bit in this story, but I think the intent, what Joab was trying to get across to David was, this woman is going to be left destitute if her other son is considered the killer and needs to be executed for his crimes. She's not going to have anyone to protect her and care for her. If Absalom, who's the apparent king to the throne, is killed, destroyed, harmed, then Israel is going to be left destitute without the rightful heir. So what Joab was trying to get David to see was that in both cases, the person that really suffers is the old woman and the nation of Israel. And I guess the best thing that he could come up with was the example of inheritance by death. Anything else? Nothing?